Well, we're supposed to. People are there will be like, send the video, we'll shoot it. All right, y'all. Okay, I don't know why that's not showing us on the screen. Oh, it's on pretty, so why not? All right, awesome. Okay, so we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday. We're going to talk a lot about George Washington, what he had to deal with. We talked about Bunker Hill. I have put up a video that takes you guys through Bunker Hill and the importance of that battle. Now, remember, Washington isn't there for Bunker Hill. He is down being the delegate for Virginia in what we now call the Second Continental Congress. Now, to you and me, it seems clear today that, well, of course they picked George Washington, right? You know, we know what happened, but it was a controversial decision at the time. Now, if you remember, the First Continental Congress had decided that they would come back in a year. They had met in 1774 in response to the Coercive Acts. They had met, and they said, hey, let's come back next year in May and kind of see where things stand. Well, boy, had a lot happen. We had Lexington and Concord. Bunker Hill, what had happened or was about to happen, blood had been spilled. And so they all get together, 12 of the 13 colonies. Once again, Georgia didn't send anybody because if they sent 3 or 4 people, that was like half of their colony. And so they chose not to do that. And you remember, ultimately, this is going to be the group that does the Declaration of Independence. But at the time, most people in Congress, most Americans, still wanted some sort of reconciliation with the British, okay? So the Second Continental Congress is given the job to pick somebody to be overall commander of what will be called the Continental Army. That's our first army. Now, there were several people that thought they should get it. One of them was John Hancock. Now, Hancock was president of the Second Continental Congress. He was also the richest man in America, so he thought he should get it. And in fact, when John Adams stands up and starts talking about the guy that he is going to nominate for a vote to be the commander-in-chief, Hancock is just kind of like waiting, you know, like if you guys go to an awards thing and you're sure you're winning, when they get ready to announce it, you're kind of like already getting ready to stand up for the awards, you know, kind of thing. And then you hear somebody else's name and you're like, what? Must be some mistake. Well, anyway, Hancock thought it was him. So, you know, Adams is talking about all that, and then Adams goes, I nominate our great delegate from the colony of Virginia. And you see, like, Hancock, like, oh, okay, he didn't get the job. And Washington is somewhat controversial because he's from the South, right? What does he know about New England people? What does he know about New England territory, our land? But, of course, he turns out to be the perfect choice. Now, it's important to understand this, too, y'all, about ambition. Today, it's okay to share that you're ambitious. Politicians do it all the time. They campaign for themselves, vote for me, or safe, right? Vote for me, or it's going to be awful. I'm the best person for it. And you ever kind of think the arrogance it kind of takes to do that? Yeah, I mean, like, hey, there shouldn't be any dictators unless it's me, okay? Kind of thing like that, right? The arrogance to say, I know how to solve the problems that other people haven't been able to solve. Thank goodness we have people willing to do it. But the thing is, y'all, people historically have been very, very afraid of people who show too much ambition. They think, oh my gosh, they want to take over or something, all righty? And so the thing is, if you were ambitious back then, you basically had to have somebody acting in your place. In fact, y'all, it wasn't until really the turn of the last century, I mean like 1900 or so, you began to see people actually campaigning for office themselves. Instead, you would have somebody else campaign for you. And you had to do this kind of false modesty, false humility kind of thing, like, what? You want me to be president? No, you really don't. No, that's not what you would. No, I would never think of doing that. No, please. Okay, if you insist, I'll do it. You had to play that game. Washington kind of had to play the game. I think he knew he was the man for this job. How do I think he knew that? Because every day he was at the Continental Congress while they were talking about this, guess what outfit he wore? That's right. His old uniform from the French and Indian War, which he still fit in and looked pretty doggone good in. So you can just imagine discussions. They're like, who do we know that has vast military experience that could possibly take this job? You'd see Washington, staying there like, do we know anybody? Because if he said, me, pick me, they're like, no, because you want the job. But eventually, John Adams nominates him, and Washington takes the job. Now, immediately, he writes to his wife like, man, what have I gotten into here, Martha? There is just no way I can pull this off. Unless, of course, God really helps me a lot. And it's a pretty interesting, thing that he goes through. And, this country is so lucky to have George Washington. Some people have called him the indispensable man. We don't have him. If he dies of smallpox when he was a kid, he had smallpox that left him with the pox mark's face. We really don't have America, or at least anything like what we do. So he turns out to be the perfect guy. There are better generals strategically. There are smarter, probably, generals. But as far as a man who could command respect, a man who could preserve our army and get away and fight another day, there's nobody like him, y'all. And let you go back to people like, some of the Romans and some of those. And speaking of Romans, in some ways he's a modern Cincinnatus. Do any of y'all know the story of the Roman general Cincinnatus? It's a great one. Cincinnatus was a farmer, just an ordinary farmer. And he goes and he fights for Rome. And he wins Rome's war, right? And then everybody's like, dude, be our dictator, be our ruler, be our emperor. And you know what Cincinnatus says? Nope, I'm going back to be a farmer. And I was like, holy cow, really? You gave that up? And Washington, y'all, as the revolution is coming to an end and Congress is just a mess, his men are going to want him to take over. They're going to say, take over. We'll follow you. We'll make you king. And he's like, no. And he, like Cincinnatus, brings his sword and he returns it to Congress and goes home to, guess what? Be a farmer. Okay? Then they'll call him back for the Constitutional Convention. They'll put it all on the line again, pull that off. And then one last time they'll say, we need you one more time, George. You need to be president. Now think about that. He had several chances to fail. And had he failed at any of those, his career would have been over, and that's all people would remember. Like, oh, yeah, George Washington. Yeah, that guy that screwed up as president. He is an amazing man. And like I said, you guys will maybe some of you are this kind of leader. It'd be awesome if you were. Or you'll meet somebody who commands respect, where you don't want to let them down. You guys will run to him like, hey, I wouldn't work this hard for anybody else, but for this person, man, you tell me what to do. I will do it. He commanded that kind of respect. And, people just kind of stood in awe of him. I remember one story from the Constitutional Convention. This one delegate, he got to think, he said, what's the deal with Washington? Why do you all treat him like a god? He said, I'm going to go up and I'm going to slap him on the back. And they're like, oh, we want to see this, okay? And so he goes up, he's talking to Washington, and of course, our conversation, he pats him on the back. You could have heard an ant burp, y'all. Everybody's like, and Washington just kind of looks down at him, and he realized, I'm never, ever going to try that again. There are people like that, y'all, and Washington was one of them. So we're very fortunate that this is the guy they picked. But what's ironic is everything seemed to kind of go against him. Yeah, he had experience, but guess what? Experience at losing battles. Like, wow, that's great, right? And of course, you and I know it was the best choice possible. But there was a big element of politics in this decision, like most things, right? Washington was a Southerner. Up until this point, y'all, the war had all been in New England. New England people, New England battle sites, except for Ticonderoga, not even a battle, way up there. Washington was a Southerner. And the hope was, if we get him, this will gain Southern support. If we bring Washington, maybe we could bring the South in on this side. And like I said, they're probably better generals in the sense of their military knowledge and skills. But what Washington could do was preserve an army, keep it going, get away when he had to. He knew what battles to fight, what battles not to. He learned. I mean, he got his butt kicked in New York, but he learned some important lessons. But the key was he could get away and live to fight another day, as I've said already a couple times. So that is the key thing to remember. Now, the next person to talk about is Henry Knox, okay, later to become our first, not Attorney General, but Secretary of War. He becomes our Secretary of War. All the pictures we have of Knox, the paintings are when he was older and, let's just say, more corpulent. What does corpulent mean? Yeah, like me, exactly. And so he loved books. So if you love books, the best thing to be is a bookseller or work in a library, right? And so he was a bookseller. He read all day. What he specialized in, y'all, was military history, particularly artillery, okay? Artillery as such, you know, cannonballs and stuff had been around, what, a couple hundred years or a little bit more? He was probably the foremost expert in the country on artillery. Another amazing thing about Washington, y'all, and this takes a certain amount of I don't want to say, it's the opposite of arrogance, of basically understanding that you're not the smartest guy in the room always. Sometimes there's somebody smarter, at least on an issue, than you are. And so Washington, y'all, was really good at finding the best talent and listening to them without feeling like, you know, hey, I got showed up by this guy. So he brings in Knox, like, dude, you know a lot more about artillery than I do. Can we get those cannons here? We need those cannons down here. And so Henry Knox makes his way all the way up, y'all, to Ticonderoga. Over 300 miles he had to travel to get up there. It's the middle of winter time, right? They drag those cannons back all the way down to Boston. And then they dig them in, and the British all wake up to discover that there are 100 cannons facing them. And it's going to cause the British Army and the British loyalists in Boston, probably all New England had, to flee eventually. Here's a picture of Henry Knox. I like that picture because we share the same stomach. Yeah, right there. Now, this incredible task was done in the midst of winter, and just a little kind of story here. I have a good friend that lives up in, he used to live in Connecticut, and so when we visit my first wife's family up there in Connecticut, I would always go visit him. And then he moved to Massachusetts. He got his parents' house, right, eventually, and in Adams, Massachusetts. So when I first went to visit him, I noticed the road we turned on was Henry Knox Road. And I'm like, Henry Knox? You mean like, you know, the guy that dragged the cannons? And he goes, yeah, they came right by this house. Well, the house wasn't there, but they came right down this road. In fact, the road was kind of cut out of the woods way back in 1775 to do that, right? And so I thought, wow, that's cool. And that's what New England is like, y'all. If you guys go to Boston or you go anywhere around Massachusetts, history is everywhere. I mean, it's just really, really cool. And hopefully you guys will get up there if you haven't before. Now, like I said, it was done in wintertime, 300 miles. They were placed around Boston. And what this does is it forces the British soldiers in Boston, right, those that had started the war at Lexington and Concord, to flee. Where's the closest place they can go? Canada, particularly Nova Scotia, right? That area that they had acquired and chased all the Acadians out back to Louisiana, right? So they go up there. And you kind of see General Howe leaving here. He's packing his stuff and going. This is still remembered as Evacuation Day in Boston. And just kind of an aside that's interesting because I love Boston. I love Nova Scotia, particularly its capital, Halifax. And the two cities, y'all, have an interesting relationship that goes back to this time, but also to Titanic, one of my other favorite things. When Titanic sank in 1912, y'all, most of us think, what happened to the bodies? What do y'all think happened to the bodies in Titanic? They froze? Did they go down with the ship? But Jack did, right? Like, don't let go, don't let go. And then what does she do? She let go, right? And so anyway, but a lot of the bodies didn't. Probably 500, 600, 700 y'all were left on the surface floating because they had life vests on. So for weeks after the disaster, they would tell people that were going through the Titanic sinking area, they would say, best that you go inside now. Be like, why? Best that you go inside now. And why? Bodies, okay? Nova Scotia, Halifax, went out there and they recovered hundreds of bodies. They took great care of them. They brought them back. Those who couldn't be identified or whose family couldn't afford to get the body and take it back, they buried them there. Even little babies, y'all, which had to be awful. So a lot of the people on Titanic have been going to New York. Well, all of them had, but a lot were intended then to go to Boston. And so Boston, y'all, was just so amazed at how Halifax had handled it and, just was really, really appreciative of it and really honored them and liked them and everything like that. All right, jump ahead 2 or 3 years later. There's a French, I think it was French, ammunition ship in Halifax Harbor. It catches on fire, blows up. Until the atomic bomb, y'all, it was the loudest, biggest man-made explosion in history. It leveled a lot of the town. Guess who now helped out Halifax? Boston, right? And so it's kind of an interesting kind of connection, and they're two of my favorite places. And, with the small tax-deductible donation, you could help me visit there this summer. So, anyway, so there you go. So anyway, y'all, in the meantime, Washington is making his way up to from Philly up to take command of the troops in the Massachusetts area. And then Washington correctly figures it out. Hal will probably, get his forces, get his you-know-what all together, and he will come after New York. So Washington takes that new Continental Army to defend New York and New York City, okay? So that's where he heads. Now, once again, y'all, a good reason why we might call Washington the indispensable man is when you look at what he had to deal with, what he had to fight. Only about a third of the colonists, y'all, were in favor of a war for independence. That number may go up slightly during the war, may go down slightly. But don't think of this war as a popular war where every American just thought this was awesome. They couldn't wait to kick the British out and that kind of thing. Only about a third of them really were that sure about independence. Now, common sense, the pamphlet will help change a lot of that. Another third were actually outright for the British. And then finally you had the third that just like, hey, I'm not on either side. Just leave me alone, man. I just want to, work my garden, have my business or whatever, be with my family. So he didn't have an overwhelming number of people on his side, 2/3 of the country was either for him or didn't really care either way. Now, this next thing to talk about is something I think it's a little bit harder for us to understand today, although as Texans, as I assume most of y'all are, it's a little bit more understandable. You guys ever see those commercials? I guess they still have them where it's like, they name some car company, so-and-so has tough trucks, tough Texas tough trucks, right? And they really push the whole Texas thing. Like, I bet you can't get this truck anywhere else but in Texas. And, they make a big deal of that. And I just can't imagine, say, Rhode Island. Rhode Island has tough Rhode Island trucks. No, it's just not going to work. Texas was an independent country. Many Texans, y'all, still kind of consider themselves almost another country. I don't know if other states have pledges. I'm sure they do. But I don't know too many other states that say they're pledged, right? But Texas does. We're our own country. Don't ever forget it, right? Probably still should be again, You kind of have that thing. And so as Texans, maybe y'all can understand this. Most Americans did not feel a loyalty to an America yet. They felt a loyalty to what? Their colony, ultimately a state. Remember when we did that chart at the beginning of the year and I made you guys talk about the economies of the different regions and how they made their money and what their religions were and how they, how their schools were and socially and ethnically and all that stuff. They were very different, y'all, back then. Each colony was very different from its neighbor. And so it was really hard to convince a lot of Americans. I'm from, let's say, Rhode Island. Why should I go fight in Virginia? I'm from Virginia. Why should I go fight for Rhode Island? They didn't really have that down yet. And this is an important concept that I think the North got rid of before the South did, because up until and through the Civil War, y'all, many Southerners felt more loyalty to their state than they did their country, even to their new country called the Confederate States of America. Robert E. Lee, y'all, was the most famous military man in America at the time, and Abraham Lincoln offered him the job to command the Union Army. Now, Lee isn't in the Confederate. In fact, his state, Virginia, still hadn't even left at this point. Lincoln's like, hey, we need you to command the Union Army to compel the southern states that have seceded to come back into the Union. Lee thinks about it and then finally says, I can't do it. I can't draw my sword against my country. Now, he wasn't talking about the Confederate States. He was talking about his country of Virginia. Okay, so kind of think that, y'all. And another thing that this always makes me remember, y'all, and it kind of brought it home, and it's weird how little things stay in your brain. But in 1983, my niece and I, and it was 83. One of my nieces, my mom and dad and I, we went to Epcot in Florida, and I was studying French in college at that point. And I'm in line, and I hear these people speaking French in front of me, this couple and their kids. And so I got to do what? I got to try out my French. So I'm like, vous êtes français? Vous êtes français? And they go, non, nous sommes parisiens. Now, what did they just say? They just said, we're not French, we're Parisian. That's like if I asked y'all, hey, y'all American? You said, no, we're from Houston. I mean, it showed what? They were more about being from Paris than they were from being French. They didn't want to be recognized as French. They want to be recognized as priests. That's how Americans were, y'all. Now, when I first, started studying this stuff, I used to give the Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, y'all, real grief, okay? Because, man, you read Washington's letters back, y'all, to Congress, they're so sad. They always start off with, in what a terrible state his military is in. My men are starving. They don't have weapons. If they have weapons, they don't have ammunition. Their uniforms, if they have them, are falling apart. Please, please send money. Please send weapons. And every time they write back like, hey, we're doing what we can. We just don't have the money, General Washington. So why was that? Well, think about it, right? Why had we justified this rebellion in the first place? What were the British doing to us, right? What were the British doing to us without representation? Taxation. So imagine if the government you intend to replace the government that was taxing you without representation starts taxing you a lot. You're like, okay, why are we in this war? And so they had to be really careful. And of course, one of the greatest weaknesses under the Articles of Confederation, our first Constitution, is going to be what? No power to tax. So essentially, y'all, what we did was we essentially made Congress go around begging states like, money for our soldiers, money for our soldiers, please, money for our soldiers, right? Going around basically asking for help. And, they didn't get a whole lot of it. I mean, imagine if our tax system worked that way. Hey, Mr. Darty, how much would you like to contribute to the U.S. government this year? How about zero? I mean, we don't like paying them. We pay them because we have to, right? And Americans didn't have to, so they did it, right? Now, what they did do was print something called Continentals. Now, I hate to say this, and this is a slam on Republicans, it's a slam on Democrats, y'all, because raising taxes is always unpopular. Can you imagine running for office like, vote for me, and I'll raise your taxes? Nobody's going to vote for you, right? We had one guy actually do that. Walter Mondale in 1984 said, vote, Bill said, you vote for him, He says he won't raise your taxes, but he will. Vote for me, and I will raise your taxes, okay? And I'll tell you I'm raising your taxes. He lost. He won one state, his own state. So rather than raise taxes, which is never popular, oftentimes our government funds stuff, y'all, by doing what? Printing paper money. Now, that's okay for a while, but what happens if you print too much money? What happens to the value of the money? What do we call it? You're not living it right now. Inflation. Hey, I used to go buy that bag of groceries. It was like $25, $30. Now it's like $50. What's going on? You notice everything is suddenly more expensive. Now, there's lots of reasons why prices have been going up. I mean, we could list 5 or 6 of them. But one of them has to do with the amount of money out there. And so the money they printed was called Continentals. And eventually, and quite quickly, it became almost worthless. Like, hey, how much is that doggy in the window? Well, if you've got coin, you got specie, it's $1. Okay? What if I've got paper money? Oh, it's like 10 then. Okay, people didn't want to take the paper money. And there was even a saying amongst my grandparents and great-grandparents, y'all, if you really wanted to diss something, you really wanted to put something down as worthless, you'd say, it ain't worth a Continental. Right? Like, oh, man, you serve that. Good diss, Continental money was worthless, y'all, because there was nothing backing it. Now, Washington's men, although quite heroic, quite brave, patriotic, they didn't have the training of British soldiers. Think about it. The British soldiers, y'all, had been trained for years, 7 days a week. They were great at their job because it was their only job. Our militiamen, they were fathers, they were farmers, they were shopkeepers. They didn't have that same kind of training. So Washington's going to have to fix that. And it's going to take a couple of years. You do not make an army overnight. Now, the next issue to talk about, y'all, hygiene, sanitation, is somewhat gross. Now, you and I live in an amazing world, y'all. I love history, and I'd love to go back in time in a lot of ways. But there's something I'm really grateful for besides the microwave and the internet. And that's this little room we have in our homes. You go in that room several times a day probably, and you take care of bodily needs. And then you do this little thing here, this little thing you pull, and it all goes away. And you don't have to deal with it. Have y'all ever thought how amazing that is? You ever thought, what if you had to collect that stuff and take it for disposal yourself? That would be awful. And yet that's what people used to have to do. So the toilet, y'all, it's up there. The flush toilet, one of my favorite inventions. I'll just give you another quick story here too, y'all. Russia was very backward during World War II. And a lot of the people were peasants and did not have indoor plumbing. So as they made their way into Germany, they started finding all these toilets that flushed. And a lot of soldiers, y'all, cut the pipes off of them, and they took them back to their little homes. And they tried to flush them, but what did they not have? The plumbing. Like, it worked in Germany. What's going on here, But anyway, so it's an amazing thing. But we didn't have that kind of thing, y'all. Wealthy people might have several pots that they would go to the bathroom in, and they would dispose of it into the river, into the backyard, into some hole or something like that. It was awful. And if you lived out in the country or in a small town, how did you handle it? You just went to the woods somewhere, right? Took care of business there. There's nobody around. And make sure you close and lock the door. Okay. They would go out and take care of it there. Now, when there's nobody around for a mile or so, is that a problem? No. But think about it, y'all. What if when you go what if you take 1,000, 2,000 people with that same mindset, and you put them in a very small area in tents, right? And they're sleeping there, and they're training there, and they still keep doing, or maybe doing, what they do back home. What are you going to get? A big steaming pile of you-know-what. It was awful. When Washington showed up and saw the sanitation, y'all, he saw men who who would just simply walk out of their tent, turn to the side, and go to the bathroom right there. And you can imagine how it began to pop. And when it rained, it went everywhere, right? And so one of the first things he had to do was convince them of the need to stop doing that. And they would dig trenches a good 100 yards or so away so that the wind and other stuff would not blow literally that crap towards them. And so this was one of the first battles they had to fight. Men who were undisciplined. Americans, y'all, we don't like taking orders from anybody. Who you telling me what to do? You know, you can't tell me what to do. I'm just as good as you, you know, especially in New England. You know, they were much more egalitarian than a lot of your Southerners were. And, you know, they didn't, quote, know their betters and their officers. So these were some of the nightmares this guy had to face. And, yeah, it gave him some headaches. Now, strategies in this war. A word you guys need to know is the word attrition. Add it to your vocabulary. Attrition, y'all, means basically the enemy is going to run out of people or cry uncle before you do, okay? You're a bigger country. You got more people. Eventually, they're going to run out of people. It's ultimately, y'all, what the North under General Grant in the Civil War did to the South. But for a while, it's what the South was trying to do to the North. So it's attrition. They're going to run out of people before you do. You wear them down. You keep making them spend their blood and treasure. Now, one of the great ironies, y'all, is the very things that helped us win the war in the Revolution are the same things that cost us wars in Vietnam and in Afghanistan. You know, Vietnam in my childhood, Afghanistan in y'all's childhood. It's hard to imagine a superpower like Britain was or we were losing a war against a much smaller, less well-armed foe. But it happened. So the way this kind of works, y'all, is you use what's called insurgent warfare. Some people call it guerrilla warfare, although that term wasn't around yet. That comes out of Napoleon and the Spanish and those, you know, that time, guerrilla meaning little warrior. But an insurgent war, y'all, is where you don't necessarily play by the rules. You don't have big battles where you come out in your uniforms and they come out in their uniforms and you fight back and forth and everybody knows who the bad guys are and who the civilians are and that kind of thing. This is a war, y'all, often fought in the shadows. Against us in Afghanistan, you know, bombs that were planted, right, by the roads. You know, roadside bombs. You're driving by in your Humvee or whatever, boom, kills you or terribly, terribly wounds you. Or you're just sitting somewhere and some car drives in, detonates, and takes out a bunch of people. It's not a normal size or a normal kind of battle. And in a lot of ways, y'all, we had learned that in the French Indian Wars. And we chose to fight like the French and Indians had fought against the British and against us, right? In that war. Hit and run. Hit them, kill as many of them as you can, and get out of there before they can destroy your forces. Don't stand in line and do battle after battle. And I'll show you guys a scene later on from The Patriot, when Americans at Camden tried to do the same thing. You kill as many of them as you can. Now, we lost Afghanistan, right? There's no way of saying it. We fought there from before y'all were born until last year. We were in Afghanistan, from late October 2001 until August 2021, y'all. 20 years. You know, people who were serving in Afghanistan lived long enough, y'all, to see their sons and daughters go fight in Afghanistan. That gives you an idea how long it went. Longer than any war that we've ever been in. Longer than probably most of our wars put together, almost, to be honest. And yet, in August, we left, right? Why did we leave? We've been there 20 years. Why not 21? Why not 19? Well, we've lost so many people. It finally didn't seem worth it anymore. It didn't seem like it was worth losing that blood, you know, lives and treasure, money over there. Finally, people said, we can't justify this anymore. And you elect people who promise to get you out of the war. And that's what the South tried to do to Lincoln. Let's keep killing him. They'll vote him out, and we'll make some sort of deal. And that's what happened to us in Vietnam. Now, when I was a kid and the Vietnam War was raging, we'd watch it every night, y'all, because it was the first televised war. You would see film of just shocking stuff. Stuff we wouldn't even probably show on TV in some cases now, because there was no censorship. And we would watch these things. But I remember one time a Pentagon spokesperson coming out, and he said, you know what? We are winning this war. We are killing like 10 of the enemy for every American that we lose. And, you know, that sounds good. Like, well, hey, make it 15, make it 20. But the thing is, what if I'm the mom? What if I'm the dad of that one American that died? Do you think I care that 10 of the enemy got killed? Probably not. What do I care? The enemy killed one of mine, okay? And that's how an insurgent war is supposed to work. You wear down the other side. You keep sending the bodies home. You keep making them spend the money. And eventually the people do what? We can't do this. Well, let's go home, right? We can't. Let's go home. And that's what the Americans did in the revolution, and it worked. And that's what was done to us y'all in Afghanistan and in Vietnam, and eventually we left. Now, of course, to probably keep fighting, to win, you need somebody helping you, somebody getting you weapons and things. In Vietnam, North Vietnam had as allies China and the Soviet Union, which kept weapons coming to them. You know, and of course, what do we end up getting? The French and the Spanish. Now, the British all are going to have a much, much tougher job in this war. Like we found out in Vietnam and Afghanistan, you can occupy the cities, small areas, you can control them, pretty much keep things, you know, going okay. But you get into that countryside, unless you're willing to just absolutely wipe it out, you know, level it, kill virtually everyone, you're not going to probably be able to hang on to that countryside. And so the British all, they tried to like gobble us up in bits. You know, let's take care of New England. Well, that didn't work too well. Let's try to take care of the middle colonies. They kind of like us there in New York and New Jersey. Well, okay, that didn't work too well. Hey, the South really likes us. Let's go down there and at least maybe hold on to the South. Now, the most effective tactic the British had was the blockade, putting ships all around the ports. Now, you remember when we looked at that map the other day, most loyalists were most popular in the city. So this was relatively easy to do, to base ships in seaports and then to patrol and make sure Americans weren't sending stuff out that would bring money into America that they could use to buy weapons and supplies, or to keep them from getting supplies maybe from an ally or even somebody who doesn't care who wants to get it to them. You think about what's happening in Russia and the Ukraine right now. And to be honest, I'm really been confused. I've gotten everything about this war wrong, y'all, despite my study of history. I really imagined, y'all, that the Russians would come around the borders there and would basically block off Ukraine in a lot of ways where the supplies could not get in. They've not done that, right? And so as a result, American supplies, European supplies are flooding into Ukraine, allowing them to continue fighting this war. Maybe Russia knew they couldn't get away with that. Maybe they were worried about starting a war in somewhere else in Europe and getting NATO involved. I don't know what they're thinking. They've fought this very badly, fortunately, for Ukraine. But since, you know, Ukraine, I don't want to say it's landlocked because it's on the Black Sea, but a lot of it is surrounded by land. They did definitely cut off the Crimea and that area that they control. But the British all tried to do a similar thing. And they were very effective, y'all. One of the things I have on y'all's notes that you'll see on that page is a map showing trade, both imports into America and exports out with the years there. And you can literally see the impact of the British blockade. They kept stuff from coming into this country. Now, the last thing is the British had, and they used this relatively effectively, although of course they could have always done more, is basically divide and conquer. Split Americans. Get them fighting each other. Use those loyalists. Get them weapons, get them uniforms, have them kill Americans. They can fight as insurgents just like Americans fight like insurgents. And think about it. Americans killing Americans, that's less people for the British to have to deal with. So using the loyalists would be an important way in this war. Now, here indeed is that graph that I was telling you guys about. And we'll stop right there. Okie dokie.